there's a presumption among conservative and libertarian circles that government is at best a necessary evil. And the authors of the Constitution didn't view it that way. They realized that in the absence of government, people will violate each other's rights on a wholesale scale, and that in the absence of government, people will behave irrationally. And so government properly done, emerges not as an evil or even as a necessary evil, but a well-constructed, just government is in fact a good.
Hello, my name is Tiffany. I'm a senior majoring in politics at Hillsdale College. This is part of a 10-week course, Constitution 101, presented by Hillsdale College. Today, you'll hear from Dr. Kevin Porteous, Assistant Professor of Politics, on separation of powers, preventing tyranny. Please watch.
Separation of powers is the central structural feature of the United States Constitution. One knows that federalism is part of the Constitution because one understands the system as a whole, but separation of powers confronts the reader of the Constitution from the very beginning. That is to say, the first three articles of the Constitution are laid out very clearly. The first article on the legislative, the second on the executive, and the third on the judicial. And it's that organizing feature that dominates the way power is allocated and the functions of government are split among the three departments. Now, this is going to be the first of two talks that we're going to be doing on the separation of powers, each of which is going to cover a different aspect of the founders' understanding of the doctrine of the separation of powers. So the first one, which we're going to be covering in this talk, is going to be the idea that separation of powers exists to prevent tyranny. And so we'll talk some more about that as we go forward. The second purpose, and the one which dominates in the Federalist Papers, that is to say, prevention of tyranny covers about 5 essays, but this second purpose, to promote effective government, to allocate power in such a way that the functions of government are assigned to institutions for specific reasons, that actually takes 32 essays for Publius to develop in the course of the Federalist Papers. And so that's going to be covered in the next section. Now, how does Publius define tyranny so that he can figure out how the separation of powers is going to work to prevent tyranny? In Federalist 47, he says that the accumulation of all powers, legislative, executive, and judiciary, in the same hands, whether of one, a few, or many, and whether hereditary, self-appointed, or elective, may justly be pronounced the very definition of tyranny. So it's the gathering together of all power in the same set of hands that presents the problem of tyranny that Madison and Hamilton hoped to solve with the system of separation of powers. And they knew from experience during the period leading up to the Constitution that this especially meant that they had to be on guard for the abuses of the legislature. Right? It was the legislatures in the 1780s that were abusing their power and that were accumulating all of the executive and judicial power into themselves. If, for instance, the Continental Congress in the 1780s had extensive debates as a legislature over what sort of tents the Continental Army should buy. And this is clearly the kind of thing that for which money should be appropriated, and then the executive should be allowed to pick the tents that are necessary. The legislature of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania was hearing divorce proceedings in individual cases. So they knew that they had to be on the lookout for abuses of the legislative power. And when they designed their system of separation of powers, they also understood that they have to find a way to make whatever partition they lay out real and effective. Now, those state legislatures, they had separation of powers declared in their constitution, but there was no actual way to make it effective. It simply said, words on paper. The legislature won't exercise executive or judicial power. The executive won't exercise legislative or judicial power. And the judicial won't exercise legislative or executive power. This turned out to be a massive failure, as the various institutions, particularly the state legislatures, simply ignored what the Constitution was telling them. So what Publius realizes in Federalist 48 is, he says, will it be sufficient to mark with precision the boundaries of these departments in the constitution of government and to trust to these parchment barriers against the encroaching spirit of power. This is the security which appears to have been principally relied on by the compilers of most of the American constitutions. But experience assures us that the efficacy of the provision has been greatly overrated, and that some more adequate defense is indispensably necessary for the more feeble against the more powerful members of the government. So they had to find some way for this separation system to be made real and effective. Okay? And over the course of the next few essays, Publius starts going through various proposals for mechanisms that could be used to correct abuses and to correct violations of the separation of powers. And he starts by talking at some length about constitutional conventions. Well, let's have constitutional conventions every once in a while as a way to fix the problem. And then the constitutional convention can come along and simply undo all of the things that the legislature has done. And what Publius realizes in Federalist 49 and Federalist 50 is that this is going to be an ineffective way to solve the problem. It put simply, the same type of person who gets elected to the legislature is going to get elected to the Constitutional Convention. And so the end result is simply that the same bad ideas that were put into law by legislatures would be put into the Constitution by a Constitutional Convention. The end result would be that the Constitution would be corrupted in addition to the laws, and that would be even harder to fix. So Publius dismisses the idea that somehow you're going to have some force outside of the Constitution, like a constitutional convention, come in and fix the problem. And so he says what we need to do is to organize the internal structure of the government in such a way that the various parts, the various actors in the government, serve as a check against one another. And so he says, look, right, here are some specific provisions that we can use, some specific mechanisms in the Constitution, but then the system itself, the overall system, has to effectively maintain the system of separation of powers. So a couple of specific provisions. He talks about the idea that the various branches of government should not be involved in electing one another. Now, of course, what should obviously come to mind is the fact that the federal judiciary is selected by a combination of the executive and part of the legislature. And Madison, as Publius, addresses this at the outset in Federalist 51. And he says, there are unique qualifications for judges that make it difficult to make them the subject of popular election. Okay? So, for instance, how many people know who John Roberts is? How many people knew who John Roberts was before his name came up in connection with a Supreme Court appointment? They do their work mostly outside of the public eye. And the nature of their work makes it problematic for them to campaign in the way a member of Congress or a presidential candidate would campaign. So the idea was, let's assign a group of people, make it their business to figure out who should be federal judges, and then let them do the appointing. And the independence of the federal judiciary will be preserved by the fact that once they're in office, they never have to stand for re-election again. They never have to come back to the president or the Senate and say, will you please reappoint me? So there's no opportunity then for the president or the Senate to criticize, to review the actions of a federal judge. That judge becomes, with the exception of impeachment, independent of the other branches. And this can have very serious consequences. Just ask the first President Bush in his appointment of David Souter. He thought he was getting a closet conservative. And what he got was one of the most reliable liberals on the court for 2 decades, and there was nothing he could do about it. Right? The fact simply was he was on the court, and Souter was free to exercise his independent judgment. Okay. It's also the case that Publius says we need to make sure that the various branches can't control or manipulate each other's salary. Now, of course, somebody has to be responsible for appropriating the money, and that natural home for that is Congress, but there are restrictions placed on how Congress can allocate salaries for all of the branches of government, including Congress itself. Most importantly, Congress is prohibited from using the salary power as a carrot or a stick to bludgeon or bribe the president into doing what the legislature wants him to do. This was a massive problem in the states in the 1770s and 1780s. Okay. But these, in the end, are minor compared to the way the overall system is going to work to preserve the separation of powers. Madison says in Federalist 51, the great security, implying that the others are important, but not as important. The great security against a gradual concentration of the several powers in the same department consists in giving to those who administer each department the necessary constitutional means and personal motives to resist encroachments of the others. Okay, so there are two important concepts that we need to think about here: constitutional means and personal motives. And the constitutional means is fairly obvious. That is to say, there are modifications to the separation of powers system that enable the overall system to work effectively. So Congress has the legislative power, but the president has a veto power. And so he can block, at least temporarily, and then subject to a higher standard for passage, the two-thirds supermajority to override his veto, any piece of legislation that Congress enacts. And there are many reasons for doing this, but one of those reasons is to allow the president some means to protect himself against a legislature that wants to allocate executive power for itself. The judiciary also has the power of judicial review, which allows it to protect itself from the legislature, among its other functions. And then, of course, the legislature, in order to protect itself from both the executive and judiciary, has the power to impeach officials of both of those branches. Now, this is not an exhaustive list of all of the constitutional means, what we today call checks and balances, right, in the system, but it does give you an idea for what they meant. They sought to make certain exceptions to separation of powers, right? Very narrow exceptions, very precisely crafted and tailored in the Constitution itself, but tailored in such a way that each of the branches could use those tools to protect the office that they held against the other branches. Okay, but none of this works if the people who hold those offices have no incentive to exercise those powers in defense of their offices. They have to have a reason to care. They have to have a reason to be concerned enough, if you're the president, to be concerned enough about the fate of the presidency to wield your powers effectively to protect the office. This is what Publius refers to as personal motives. And it's here that he makes what is probably the most famous single-sentence statement in the entire book. Of all 85 essays in the Federalist Papers, he says, ambition must be made to counteract ambition. And this is where we get to the real lesson of separation of powers. Separation of powers is important. It's something that we should be aware of. But one of the great things about not only the separation of powers, but also the entire book, The Federalist, generally, is that what you get is an analysis of and a treatment of how the Founding Fathers understood human nature and human political behavior. What motivated people, what didn't motivate people, what opportunities that presented, and what challenges that presents. They try to take a very realistic assessment of who we are. So how does this work? Well, we create offices, right? And we create offices that have the kind of power that an ambitious human being would want. That is to say, if you are the secretary-treasurer of some local organization, and there's no real authority attached to that, what would you care if somebody came along and started taking the minutes at meetings for you? You would still get the credit for holding the office, while the other person did the real work. Now, that's fine for a Kiwanis Club or something of that nature, but for government, where the rights and well-being of citizens are at stake, that is enormously problematic. And so we need to make sure that we create offices that ambitious people are going to want. Because if you create those kinds of offices, you will get ambitious people. President of the United States, that's real power. Right? Senator, congressman. Right? Ambitious people can have their desire for power, for honor, for glory. They can have those desires fulfilled through a constitutional office because it has real power. But the source of the power is the office as created by the Constitution. So the people who hold those offices know that if they want power, they have to protect the office. They have to preserve the powers and prerogatives that the Constitution assigns to that office. Because if they don't, one of the other branches will begin to exercise that power. Congress will begin to do executive things. Right? The courts will begin to do legislative things. And so it's essential then, right, that if that person, if a congressman or a president wants to fulfill his ambition, wants the respect of the community, wants the honor of the community, then he's going to have to hold on to the power of the office. And so Publius describes it this way. He says, the constant aim is to divide and arrange the several offices in such a manner as that each may be a check on the other, that the private interest of every individual may be a sentinel over the public rights. So, to translate that a little bit, if every officer of the government is holding on to the power that the Constitution assigns him, and he's effectively doing so because the Constitution has empowered him to protect his office, then it becomes extremely difficult, right, although not necessarily impossible. There's no way to guarantee in these situations. But it becomes extremely difficult for other branches to seize his power. Right? And if all of the officers of the government are doing this, right, and all of the officers of the government have the constitutional means and the personal motives to protect the offices that they hold, then Publius says what you'll get is the offices will stay roughly in the same position relative to one another. Right? That pulling against one another, rather than being a defect of the system, is actually one of its primary and most important features. Right? The result is that no one branch is able to accumulate all of the power. And if you'll recall from the beginning of our talk, it's the accumulation of all that power in one set of hands that constitutes the definition of tyranny. Okay, so what larger lesson can we draw from this arrangement? Well, this understanding of how we need to set up government says something really important and not always particularly pleasant about human nature. He says, it may be a reflection on human nature that such devices should be necessary to control the abuses of government. But what is government itself but the greatest of all reflections on human nature? If men were angels, no government would be necessary. If angels were to govern men, neither external nor internal controls on government would be necessary. That is to say, we don't have, and we are all very familiar with the consequences of believing that there is some race or class of supermen who are naturally fit to govern us. Those people simply do not exist. Right? There is no race of what Plato talks about as philosopher kings. For those of you with more of a pop culture orientation, you may recall in the movies or books, Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings, there is a class of human beings, of which Viggo Mortensen's character is one, who are acknowledged by everyone as superior and fit by nature to govern. And so all Aragorn, Viggo Mortensen's character, has to do is assume his rightful throne, and everyone will follow him. That doesn't exist for us. Right? If we're going to have government, it's just going to be us. Stupid, selfish, irrational us. And so we've got to figure out a way that people drawn from that stupid, selfish, irrational population can govern one another without oppressing one another. That's extremely difficult. We aren't perfectly rational. Right? Angels would govern perfectly. We wouldn't have to worry about them abusing power because, and this is the way Madison seems to be interpreting angels would be perfectly rational, they would always govern justly, and so we would never have to fear abuses of power on their part. But when you've got human beings in charge, you've got to be concerned about abuses of power. Right? Because that's what human beings do. Right? Or at least that's what they're capable of doing. Right? If given the opportunity, human beings will violate each other's rights. Right? And if you'll remember from earlier in the course, the protection of individual rights is the primary purpose for which government is formed in the first place. Without government, there is no effective security for our rights. So we need to find out a way, right, to organize the system in such a way that it takes account of the realities of who we are as human beings, right, our potentials and our failings, right, and turn that in such a way that it serves the cause of justice. In Federalist 15, Alexander Hamilton says, "Why has government been instituted at all? Because the passions of men will not conform to the dictates of reason and justice without constraint." That's not who we are. That is to say, our founding fathers, whatever else they were or were not, were certainly not libertarians. Properly done, government is an essential good, as opposed to the libertarian view in its purest form that government of all kinds, by definition, is nothing but an organized criminal enterprise. Government is absolutely necessary. The problem is, because of our fallen, imperfect, irrational nature, we make a mess of it a lot. And we design many bad governments for many bad reasons. All right. So what did then Publius, the founding fathers, think about human nature? Well, they did recognize that part of human nature was good, that there are positive aspects to human nature, and that we need those. He says in Federalist 55, this is Madison again, "As there is a degree of depravity in mankind, which requires a certain degree of circumspection and distrust, so there are other qualities in human nature which justify a certain portion of esteem and confidence. Republican government presupposes the existence of those qualities in a higher degree than any other form." If our governors are to come from amongst ourselves, there has to be within us the capacity for good. If human beings are entirely degraded, entirely selfish, entirely perverse, then the only thing that can restrain us from killing one another is the strong hand of an authoritarian government. Self-government presumes that we are capable of governing ourselves. It is impossible to have political self-government if human beings are incapable of personal self-government. If they are not capable of ordering their lives in just and effective ways, even if they deviate from those standards, those rules, those maxims, even if they make mistakes, and all human beings make mistakes, they have to be capable of being good. On the other hand, Publius takes an exceedingly realistic view of human nature. So in another essay, the 6th Federalist paper, he says, and this is about as cynical and pessimistic as one can get in an assessment of human nature. This is Alexander Hamilton. He literally says, quote, "Men are ambitious, vindictive, and rapacious." And the problem with the old governments prior to the Constitution is that they presumed the good, but not the bad. They paid no attention to the problems of human nature. And they simply assumed that if you put government in the hands of the people, that just government will follow. And this is a lesson they had been taught from the colonial experience. The problem that they struggled with in the late colonial period was the problem that political power was being exercised by people who were not chosen by the people. The king and his ministry in England would appoint royal governors and lieutenant governors, and those people would exercise executive power. And those royally appointed governors would be in tension with the locally elected legislatures. So, when they began to draw up constitutions, right, it was very hard to resist the temptation to simply say, well, the elected legislature, that's the bulwark of liberty, and the unelected governor, that's the danger. So let's put government in the hands of the people, and then everything will be fine. And one of the lessons they learned really quickly was that even the people are capable of doing unjust things. It presented a very odd scenario, a democratic despotism. Let me give you an example. The state of Rhode Island was probably the worst offender during this period. And the worst offense that the states were committing were in their various what were called paper money laws. What happened was that most people, and this is true of every society, most people were in debt and very few people were creditors. So what the debtors figured out was that they could elect majorities to these state legislatures that had no brakes or restraints that were effective. And so what they did was they elected majorities who were pledged to do things to help out the debtors. So what the legislature did was started printing paper money, lots of it. And of course, simple supply and demand tells us that when you flood the market with something, the value of it necessarily decreases. They coupled this plentiful paper money with laws requiring creditors to accept the paper money at face value in payment of debts, right, when the original loan was made in gold or silver. And so the debtors would approach their creditors and say, I've got the $1,000 I borrowed. I'm ready to pay you back. Right? But when the creditor then goes and turns around and tries to buy gold, he will find that the $1,000 in paper money will only buy $100 in gold. What happened to the other $900? Well, the law authorized the theft on the part of the debtor. The debtor got to keep it and pay it back in depreciated paper money. What made Rhode Island uniquely unjust in this regard was that they required the acceptance of this paper money. If one did not accept the paper money, one went to court. But it was a special kind of court, where it was a 3-judge panel, there were no juries, right? There was no right of appeal, right? And only the fact was at issue. Did you or did you not accept the paper money? In other words, the state of Rhode Island set up kangaroo courts that were designed to guarantee convictions against creditors. And in one case where the judges ruled in favor of the creditors, the voters of Rhode Island tossed the judges out in the next election. They fixed that problem, such as it was. Okay. So we have this scenario in which the people are partly good and partly bad. And the founders' solution then is not to pretend that it's not the case, as was the case in the state legislatures in the 1770s and 1780s. They also don't engage in any kind of belief or schemes based on the belief that human nature can be modified. And this constitutes one of the key differences between the constitutionalism of the Founding Fathers and the modern progressive state. Leading progressive intellectual Herbert Crowley says that the entire progressive project is predicated on the idea that human nature can be improved. That we can, over time, educate out the unjust, the bad, the irrational parts of human nature. That we can change people to the point that these kinds of mechanisms are no longer necessary. And we can do it by tinkering with the law, with the culture, with the economic structure, with the educational system. So that at about the same time, Theodore Roosevelt, who was greatly influenced by Herbert Croly, comes along and says, look, I'm sick of all this talk about the tyranny of the majority. We put the government in the hands of the people. We should trust the people. What I'm concerned about and what I see when I look around is the tyranny of the minority. It's not the people that are the problem. It's what are later come to be called the economic royalists, the robber barons. Those are the people we need to be watching out for. And what we need to do is empower the government to act on behalf of the people in order to rein in these elites. But all of that is predicated on the idea that human nature can be improved to the point where the governors, right, the people in office, are not a threat to the liberty of the people. And that the quality of the people, the human nature of the general population, can be improved to the point where they won't choose people that are a threat to liberty. Founding Fathers rejected this concept outright, and you see that in the separation of powers structure. They realized that human nature is somewhat more durable than progressives believed. And that consequently, the attempt to create perfect governments, perfect systems, perfect regimes, right, the attempt to create utopias was impossible. Hamilton says in Federalist 6 that it's time that we awoke from the deceitful dream of a golden age, right, of perfect wisdom and happy virtue. That world doesn't exist. Not for us. Not for human beings. Maybe for some other species in some other place, but not for us. That's not who we are. Right? We're just human beings. We have the good in us, but we also have the bad. And so what the Constitution attempts to do is to realize that ambition is part of who we are, that we can't get rid of it, that we can't change it, that we can't educate it away, and to take it, accept it for what it is, channel it through the Constitution so that when it comes out on the other side, it's directed toward something useful. That ambition is run through the mechanisms, through the system of the Constitution in such a way that that ambition is made to serve the public good. That ambition is made to serve the rights of the people. This attempt to create utopias, this attempt to improve human nature, to create a new man, is really the root cause of the modern totalitarian ideological tyrannies of the 20th century. If one looks at people like the Nazis and the communists in their various incarnations, what one finds is that each of them had a vision of a perfect society and a perfect person, right? The new socialist man. The person who is freed from all private concerns and who serves only the public. That will be the basis, right, of the Marxist-Leninist dictatorship of the proletariat. Right? The problem is that once one begins embarking on this project, in order to create this utopia, it is necessary to purge in one fashion or another all of the unregenerate elements from within the society. Anyone who doesn't fit the mold, and in the case of the Nazis, that meant on the basis of race, and the communists on the basis of ideology, those people have to go. If they can't be reformed, right, they have to be expunged. And that may mean sending them off to work camps. It may mean simply terminating them. But it is absolutely necessary to do that in order to bring about this perfect world that the modern ideological despots think is possible. And they think it's possible because they think they can change human nature. Founding Fathers knew better. They understood that far from having grown or evolved beyond the need for separation of powers constitutionalism, today's problems And the world we see around us only underscore the continued importance of separation of powers as a system. Many of these problems have come to pass because, precisely, in rejecting the separation of powers, the progressives and their descendants have rejected the founders' understanding of human nature. They believed that they could create a class of people who would inhabit the various offices, the administrative apparatus of the state, who would have no other purpose or interest but the service of the public good. That the self-interest, the private interest, could be taken away from them. Through training, through the right cultural environment, and so it became necessary then to create that environment so that they could create this class of disinterested, public-spirited bureaucrats. And it's amusing to note, as a closing thought, that the person who really destroyed this understanding that one could create such a class of people was Karl Marx himself. And Marx realized, this is not widely known, Marx realized that this bureaucracy would constitute an interest unto itself. That the same aspects, the same selfish, ambitious aspects of human nature that Madison identifies in Federalist 51 would reassert themselves no matter how hard we tried to suppress them. And that bureaucracy then, becoming an interest unto itself, would seek to expand itself, would seek more power, more budget, more staffing, and that interest would not necessarily have anything to do with the public interest. But again, this gets us back to the durability of human nature that Madison, Hamilton, and the other founding fathers identified, understood, and built a frame of government around. And the keystone of that understanding is embodied in the system of the separation of powers.